Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone attending today's webinar. Apologies for the short delay. Today's webinar is titled, Are you getting the most value out of your IBM Connections environment? And it's the third in our series highlighting topics of interest according to our customers and partners. My name is Danny. I'll be assisting Femke in the background with today's webinar. Before we do get started, a bit of housekeeping to go through. Your phone line or computer mic will be muted, but of course we encourage you to ask any questions that you have in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar program. The webinar itself is scheduled to go for 45 minutes. That includes a Q&A at the end of the presentation. And today's presentation will be recorded, shared on our webinar page of our website, the link to which you'll be sent in the next couple of days as a registrant follow-up email. Now, before I hand it over to Femke, I'll just go through the agenda today. First off, Femke is going to identify what drives a successful IBM Connections platform. And also give some examples of success. She'll determine activities to monitor and drive your platform. That will also include a demonstration. And finally, as I said, there'll be some questions and answers from you. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Femke.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that everything is working now. Welcome to this webinar, and my apology for the slight delay. That was my fault. My PC decided to crash on me right before we started. But let's start with this session today and about the topic of IBM Connections and how to drive it to be a successful platform. Because that's not a topic that is very easily answered, to be honest. When you're talking about successful platform for IBM Connections, then a lot of things that turn up quite easily are things like we want to have context-driven connections, meaning that we want people to connect to each other, but not just by connecting to everyone they know, but literally by finding the people that are interesting for them to connect with and to learn from or to see information from. We want people to collaborate, not just within their own teams or their own departments, but we want them to collaborate across all the borders. That's why you're implementing IBM Connections. That's why you're driving this social enterprise project. And we want to manage the knowledge that our environment has, and we want to make it available to as many people as possible, or as relevant, of course, that should be having that information in the organization. And lastly, but very importantly, we want to really develop our people and processes, and not top down, but bottom up, meaning that we want people to be empowered to really find their own best ways of working with this platform. And we want people to really find new ways and innovate on what they can do when working together with other people within the organizations. So you're really literally empowering the user without them constantly having to ask IT, by providing them with a platform that gives them a tool set to self-determine how to fill out their processes and how to work their processes. So great and lofty ideals, but how do you get there? Because, well, let's face it, that's not always that easy. When you're talking about normal system implementations and normal situations where a software is implemented, then it's often done in quite a waterfall kind of theory, meaning that you start with a concrete use case, you select a platform or an application, you implement it, you train your users, and then voila, you have your success scenario, if everything went right. And that's more or less it. So look at it, for instance, if you're installing a sales system, what you need is a system that allows you to register your contacts, to monitor all your leads and your sales, and that is a system that you have to select. But once you have that, it's more or less static, and it will not really develop a lot around that unless you come up with completely new use cases. Now, a social enterprise network comes from a totally different way of starting out this whole process, because instead of finding out what your use case is right at the beginning and then selecting your platform and implementing it, what you do is you're implementing a platform that more or less is aimed at finding the use cases for it. So of course you have the overall use case that we just described, which is to get people to collaborate and to share information and to manage your knowledge. But what you really want is people to find their own use cases for this platform and to innovate on that and to drive their own business outcomes with it. That's why you're implementing a social enterprise network. And that sometimes also makes it very hard to then drive a successful platform, because how do you get your users to do that? How do you motivate them? And how do you actually measure all those things? So what a successful platform is not an easy determination. And it's not always easy either to find out how to even measure that. Now, if you look at different systems out there, and I see I made a heck of a typo there in information, but my apology for that, is that people try to find out what drives success in an application or in a platform. Well, this is an information system success model that was developed by DeLone and McLean. This is already quite an old one. I think the original version is from '95, but it has since then been adapted. And what it kind of says is, to start out, you need to have a quality system that is just a great tool, more or less, that works and that does what it needs to do. Then you need to have quality information. So the information that you put into the system has to have value and relevance. And then you have to have a good support system so that if users have questions or problems or need training, that is all available. All those factors will then drive your usage, and they will drive your user satisfaction, because if users are more satisfied with the service, then they will also use it more, and the other way around. When they're using it more, it usually can also drive your user satisfaction. All of these factors then contribute to the net benefit, the net value that you add by implementing this system. So it all kind of links together and combines together to make that end result of getting your net benefit or for your platform. So what are key factors then? Well, as already stated before, it's the tool that you select. In this case, you selected IBM Connections. Great. Now you need to make sure that it is performing. So you need to have insight into how is the up and down time? Are all the services up? Is it working? Then you need to know, is it being used? Because, well, let's face it, if your users aren't using it, then you will not drive your benefit. Are they creating content, and is that actually quality content? Can you keep it relevant? Is it still up to date? Because again, if you have a lot of content in the system, but it's not up to date or not relevant, your users will not be satisfied with it and therefore stop using the system. And then, what interaction do you see? Are people connecting to each other? Are they communicating in communities? Are they sharing files? Or is it just people that on their own are just kind of broadcasting instead of you really consuming? And then lastly, how do you support all this? And I'm not necessarily meaning in a help desk or people that are fixing the problems, but also in terms of how do you drive this? If you're an adoption consultant, what information do you need to help the users to really get insight into what is happening and how to work with it? So let's look at a few examples of where IBM Connections can really help your organization and drive it to be a successful platform. Well, the first one is that if you want to use IBM Connections to do things like knowledge management and sharing, then you need to drive people to work more out loud. Now, that's definitely a culture question, so you need to really talk to the users and explain to them what the benefit is of working more in the open and sharing information abroad. But secondly, what you can also do, and which is a kind of a basic, is get people to not work only by email. And yes, this is a culture thing again, because people are very used to email and they love email and they don't see any reason why not to email. But if you explain to them the benefits of not doing it in an email, for instance, that you have one overview of all the versions of a document, or that you can have information in a central place so that when somebody new joins the company, you don't have to forward all these individual emails to get them the relevant information, then you can really help them. So an example from our own environment here is what we did. We monitored to see how the usage was of email in regards to emailing to groups of people. Now, If I want to inform a group of people in the old situation, what you would do is you would send a newsletter or you send an email, and you would send it to more or less everyone in your department or anyone in your company. And as you can see in this graph, the number of recipients on emails was like, okay, it's about 37% was sent to one person, then there is about 10% sent to two persons, so they have two recipients in the email. And then we have these peaks here, which show me that there is a lot of email traffic going to quite a large group of people, probably a department, or in this case, actually, a bigger department. Now, what you want to obtain, and what you could obtain if you really drive your IBM Connections environment, is to get to a situation like this, which is the same organization just a year and a half later, but now you see that 73% of all the emails is actually being sent to only one person, and only 2.5% is sent to 10 to 20 people. So that's a big benefit. Now, what happened here is that people, instead of sending the email to their department or their group, started to create these communities and starting to communicate this information in the community, making it accessible to the whole community, making sure that everyone who had access can actually see it, even if they didn't get the email, and also allowing this information to be shared with new people that come in at a later stage more easily. So monitoring your email volume can actually tell you quite a lot. It can tell you more, by the way. For instance, in this case, what you see here is the mail volume between groups within the organization. Now, the sales department is the #2 sender in this case when it comes to ranking and for sending information to organization, which is a group within the panagenda address book. Now, as you can see, there's 3 ones that I actually highlighted. These are mails or from or to external parties. So in this top 20 of email correspondence between different groups within the organization, the emails to the external parties are not actually the leading ones, meaning that there is a lot of internal communication going on between departments, between people through the email. Again, what we want is that we want the internal communication more to be in the open, to work out loud. So we want to get people to not send email all the time. And what do we see if we look at these same numbers a year and a half later? Then you can see that this actually worked, because here we have now in the top 10 alone 8 situations where the recipient or the sender is actually the external party. So it's no longer a case where most communication internally is done in email, and therefore it frees up the places for the external mail. So great insights into seeing where connections can really help your organization to work in a different way. Now, other things you can look at is if your organization has other applications that are stimulating the sharing of information, like for instance team rooms or quickers or discussion libraries, then you would also try to get those people to see the benefits of IBM Connections and to move over. And again, that's not always easy to do, because how do you even identify who's working where? One of the things you could do is to look at the usage of these applications. For instance, in this case, I'm looking at an application that was used as a discussion library, and what I can see here in the usage is that this discussion library is used by several departments quite heavily. For instance, the sales department and the consultants department. Now, if I have this information, I can then address these departments quite directly and ask them, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to use a community instead and to share this information? But because apparently there's more departments using this, maybe it should be interesting for other departments as well. So again, having insight into what is happening in an application can then help you communicate with these users about the benefits of your IBM Connections environment. So knowledge across your platform, not just from IBM Connections, but also from your email and from your applications. And I'm looking here at the Domino application, but of course there's other tools that are out there that can help you identify these kind of things for other applications as well, can really help you drive the IBM Connections investment. What you eventually want is to come to a situation where you have a lot of communities where people are communicating. Now, this is an example of a very large organization. They have 21,000 communities, which is a very big environment. But this overview immediately shows me what is happening here, because each of these bubbles are communities. And I can see what type of communities they are by looking at the colors. So the red ones are the restricted communities, and you can see those are in generally a lot smaller because they have less users. The public communities are blue, and the moderated communities are yellow. I also have external communities in here, so I can really divide between what's going on. And the more up they are here, the more activity there is going on in terms of ads or edits or people commenting or liking. The more to the right they are, the more reads there are. So communities that are up in this quadrant up here are the communities that are most heavily used. And the size of each bubble represents the number of users. So this just gives me a great overview of what's going on in my environment. But at the same time, it also gives me a responsibility, because 21,000 communities, there is probably going to be a lot of communities in there that are no longer being used or actively being used. So I need to manage this as well, and I will come back to you on how to do that. And then to show you an example of one of those big communities, that big yellow bubble that you just saw in the right upper corner, that represented in this case a community that has over 10,000 members, about 5,000 followers or 4,500 followers, and 7,000 active users. Now what is interesting here, I can have members and followers, but the active users are the ones that are actually in the system or in the community. And in this case, you can see that 2,600 of them are not even a member. So these are people that didn't become a member of this community, but still accessed this community in the last 30 days. Okay, so that's a bit about some examples of what could happen and how your environment actually could grow. Here are also some activities that you need to do to monitor and drive your IBM connections, or that you can do. There's various ones. I'm not going to do everything or mention everything, but some of them that can really help you is that you need to do system health monitoring, and preferably continuously, because you really want to know what's going on. You need to have proactive administration, you know, before the user ends up having an error. If you can prevent them from getting that deterrent, then you can keep them happy, you can keep them satisfied, which is actually what we want to drive that net benefit. Identification of potential compliance issues. Do you have users that have gone away but left their files? And what is happening to those files? Do you need to reassign them to some other user? Etc., etc. There's different ones here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's look at some examples. Continuous system health monitoring, seeing how the login times are for your system. Why is this important? Well, if your user is running into problems because the forums are taking nearly 8 seconds to load, then that could really drive your user satisfaction down. So by seeing this and by being active and more active than just responding to a help desk call, you can actually prevent them from calling the help desk and make sure that you are doing it before them. You can also see here what's going on in terms of what things are not running. In this case, for instance, I can see that one of the data sources isn't running. So if I click on this, what would happen? Well, I would get an overview of all the services the system has, and now you can see that the docs version currently isn't running. Now, it hasn't been running for a while, apparently, so in this case, it's probably something that was brought down planned, but it could be that one of your services went down and you didn't even realize it, because IBM Connections is a collection of services, and one going down doesn't mean that everything goes down. Also important is seeing what trends do. How are the login trends over time? And what happened here when sometimes the peaks are really high and why the average is really high. In this case, we identified that this was a server change, and well, apparently it wasn't a good one because the performance really went down. So in this case, what was done was replaced it back with another server, and then the performance was better again. So being proactive and managing these things before your users find them out is usually a good thing, but also because it gives you insight over time into what is going on. Managing quotas. If you have quotas on your system, which most systems do, then being able to see which communities and which users are running into the problems there can really help you prevent them from running into it themselves. You don't want a user to find out that he can't upload a file because his quota has been reached. So if you see that a user has already reached 80 or 90% of his quota, then you can consider giving him more quota, or consider talking to him about all the different opportunities or possibilities there are of sharing information, perhaps in a different way. Maybe he should share some information in a community instead. In my opinion, you should just give him more quota, but then again, that changes per organization, of course. And like I said before, identifying orphaned files, users that are no longer in the organization, but still have files in there. And some of them might be public, so as in this case, but this file is public and only shared for reading with one community, meaning that nobody can actually change this. So in case this document should change, for instance, because it's no longer relevant or should be removed, then nobody can actually do that at this moment. So it would be a good idea to think about reassigning certain files or determining how many files the user has. You can easily sort by owner and then see how many files he has before he left. Addressing orphaned or dormant communities. Another one is quite important. If you are working with communities in IBM Connections, then one of the things that can happen is that at a certain point you'll see that there is an owner in the community. And as you can see, I can quite nicely hear how many owners each community has. But if that owner leaves the company, then you might end up having a situation where there's no owner anymore. What do? Do you just leave that community there, or do you identify it? Because suddenly there is a community with information in it that doesn't have a responsible person anymore. So there is no one that can add or remove members. There is no one that can take responsibility for the choices around what needs to happen with the data in the community. So identifying a new owner is quite important. And by having the name of that community and by being able to directly click through to the community, you can then, for instance, look at what other members there are or what people added content to it to identify a potential new owner. So all kind of actions that you could take to really make sure that your communities are up to date and relevant. Another thing that's interesting in this overview is actually that you can see how your communities are being used. In the last 7 days, about a quarter of the communities in this environment were accessed. Now, this is a small environment with only 89 communities, but you could have a larger environment and totally different numbers. Another thing you can see here is that over the time, so in 30 days and in a year, communities are more used. Now, how is that explainable? Well, part of it could be with seasonal trends. Maybe some communities are only relevant in certain periods of time, or not are only used for archives or backup information. The other reason is that some communities just go out of usage over time. So again, it's very well possible that these communities that haven't been accessed in a year just lost their relevance and should be looked at. Okay, let's look at some community info and demos, and let's see if we can actually see a bit of what is going on in an environment more proactively. Let me switch over to IBM Connections and show you the operational dashboard here. The operational dashboard is the place where users can see all that information, or your administrator can see all that information about how your system is doing. So as you can see, I can see what the login times are, and I can click through on them and then get the trend information. I can see the data sources and the ones that are down. I can go into details. So all this information is available to an administrator to do that health check monitoring. This is an ideal situation to have. You know, if you don't have this information and you will constantly have to monitor your logs or your services themselves, then it can be quite hard. And having all this information in one overview can make it more easy for your support system to really make sure that everything is performing. In the activity overview, you can look at what your users are doing. Now, again, if you're talking about the system that we are, the classification that we're just talking about, the IS system, then one of the things that they were looking at was the usage. How many people are logging into the system? Why is this important? Well, the more people that are actively engaged with the system, the bigger the chance of having relevant connections. And that's exactly what we want to have. So having information about how many of your people are logging in over time, and again, we're looking at 1 week, 30 days versus a year, gives you a better image of what is going on and whether or not your users are actively logging in. It doesn't say anything about the engagement, of course, but it does say if they're at least in the system so they could engage. It also differentiates between internal and external users so that you can also see what is going on there. So in this situation, there's only internal users, but if your environment has external users, it's very important to also get that insight, because external users are even harder to motivate usually than your internal users to use a system. And when I want to know more, so for instance, when I want to know information about the login information, then I can always look at the actual user data. What would be interesting? If I'm an IBM Connections consultant responsible for driving the adoption of the platform, then one of the things is that I would want to know who's not logging into the system. Because again, being on the system means that there is a bigger chance of being connected and getting information or sharing information or learning from information. So what I can do is look at this last login column, and I can sort it, and I can see which users haven't logged in for a while. Now, I can see here, for instance, what their manager is, but I can also add additional information. As you can see, there's different columns here. So one of the things that I could do is now to look at the work location and see if there is a correlation between the people and the location where they are in terms of usage of the platform. Because one of the effects that we often see is that if certain users aren't using the system, then other users around them stop using the system as well. And the other way around. If you get certain users to use the system, then other users around them will start using the system. So having indications of, for instance, if it's related to a department or a work location can really help you to then target also your adoption efforts. Do you need to provide, for instance, a training session here in Boston, New York, because there's quite a lot of users that haven't used it there for quite a long time? Or should you look at the manager to see if it's maybe something that was brought down top down? Maybe this manager didn't like the system and has told his people not to. Well, let's see. If we look at Brandon here, I can quite easily select him and then get all the people that he has under him and see when they last logged in. And as you can see, quite a lot of them have not recently logged in. Last login was actually in May. So again, this is just information that can help you as an adoption consultant to then really start thinking about your adoption programs and about your adoption strategy in terms of where do we need to provide training, where do we need to maybe talk to a manager and see what's going on, why are your people not using it, should we maybe explain the benefits of the system so that you then can actually help drive the effort to get these people more connected. And as you can see, there's lots of information we can use in this case where we really want to know what is going on. And there's even more information, like you could also think about plotting out what users are connecting with what other users, or what activities are users doing. All these kind of things can really drive your strategies for doing the adoption. Now, I can, of course, also see some information like which elements are they using most often. How are they using the system over time in terms of different applications? For instance, as you can see here, the light green is profiles, is used most often in this environment. And you can see a definite drop-off here during the weekends, where the system is hardly used by anyone at all. So that kind of information can drive the efforts that you put in to get users to understand certain things. Now, we have users, but we also have communities. And the communities is where most of the collaboration takes place, because that is where you get people to share that information and knowledge. Yes, there's also individual applications, which we're showing right now. But the communities is where you really get that connectivity between the action, the content, and the user and the people. So let's look at the communities in this environment. This is an environment with about 80 or 90 communities. And as you can see, I can now see the different communities in there. Each bubble represents a different community. And the size of the bubble represents the number of distinct users that are accessing that community in the last 30 days. So in this case, the corporate executive education community is quite popular. Why is this relevant for me to know? Well, if I want to identify, for instance, success cases, or if I want to know which users I could ask about being a champion for the system, or to help drive adoption among other systems, other users, then you can actually look at these communities and identify quite easily which ones are the front runners. So go into that community and take a look at it so that you can actually learn from that system. And you can also see more details about this system. So let's take a good look at this community and see a bit more. So we have the corporate and executive education community. We can see the number of members. We can see the number of owners. In this case, 5 out of those 36 are owners. We can also see that 28 people are following, and of that 28 followers, 75 are actually also members. So you can be a follower without actually being a member of a community, and the other way around. You can be a member without actually being a follower. So as you can see, only half, slightly more than half of these members are following this community. Why is that important? Well, a community that is followed by a lot of people has a bigger reach than the community that only has a lot of members. Because the people that follow the community actually get the updates that something is happening, while you can be a member and not a follower and never get an update at all. So seeing that information can, again, give you a good insight into what's going on. I can also see how many active members there were, and in this case, or active users, there were 13 people that were not an active user or not a member and did actively access the community. So they read something, they entered there, or they looked at it. They can't change anything because they're not a member, but they can definitely access it because it is a public community. Now, what are they doing? In here, you can see the different applications within the community that are available and how they're used. So we're currently looking at this period of about a week, and I can now see over time, and as you can see, this slightly, this donut actually changes with it, what kind of applications were more popular. And it's quite funny to see that if I go all the way to the beginning, then wikis really set it off, and other parts like the forum were slightly less, but over time this kind of changed. And if we look at it now, then wikis is only about a quarter of the content being interacted with. So files is actually gone up quite a lot, and forums even has gone down a bit more to 10% of usage. Also, the size of the number of activities actually grew a lot. So I can definitely see that there is stuff going on there and that people are actively using it. The same goes for the type of activity, because you're not only interested in what are they doing, but you're also interested in how or what type of interaction they're having. So I don't just want to know if they're working with files or wikis, but I want to know if they're reading them or if they're interacting with them in terms of commenting, liking, editing them, and whether or not they're composing this, so if they're creating new content in the community. And again, you can change the time period to see what is going on and see a historical overview, so that you can see, for instance, also if certain campaigns that you did, like trying to get users to understand the importance of using a forum, is actually taking up and making effect in that community. So great information for any adoption consultant to really look into this information and do more with it. Okay, now there's lots more that you could do with information, but let's get back to the presentation for now. What is important, and this is just a bit of a recap, is monitor and manage your system's health. Proactively manage and tackle any problems that could occur before they become a deterrent. So like I said, don't let your users run into a quota limitation, because really that is such a turn-off for a user that wants to share something and is not allowed to. Stimulate innovation by identifying those use cases that users come up with that you never thought of, because that is that reiterative process that I showed in the beginning. That is what you want. The users will build the value of your platform by finding new ways of using IBM Connections. Not you necessarily by telling them how to use it, but by themselves figuring out new ways of doing it. And I've seen very creative solutions in using IBM Connections, where users came up with totally different ways of working that I had never even thought of. Keep your data relevant and the data owners aware of their responsibilities. If you have communities that are no longer active, inform them. Literally, that environment with 20,000 communities had about 4,000 communities that hadn't been accessed in a year. So by sending out a mailing to all these community owners and telling them, hey, you have a community here, it hasn't been active in over a year, what needs to happen with it, or can we help you? Do you want to migrate some stuff over to another community maybe? Or do you want to take a good look at the data to see if it's still relevant? You can really drive that responsibility with the owners themselves. Identify compliance issues, communities that are no longer being used or no longer have a manager or owner in it. Community files that have become orphaned because the user that created them has gone away and hasn't assigned someone else editor rights. Those kind of things are really important. So make sure that you're aware of them, that you have insight in what's going on, and that you use the tools that are available to keep a track of that. And invest in continuous change and training programs, because all of this makes no sense if you see it as a one-time only project. Connections only thrives when you constantly help users understand what it is for, how they can use it, how they can come up with new ideas, how other people came up with new ideas that might be interesting for them, and by giving them training. New users need to be trained as well, because if you just drop them into a system like this without any explanation, then they will drown and they will not know how to use it, and eventually we'll see your adoption rates go down. So really drive your adoption, not just from a technical point of view, but really from a user point of view, and invest in the people that do that. And always keep an ear to the ground and talk to the people that are using it, because they know what's going on as well. So don't only trust numbers or graphs or what managers might tell you. Take surveys, do polls, go interview users, do roadshows where you talk to users and get their opinions and questions, and use that information to then create even more and better information so that you can better help them. Now, how could Panagenda help you with that? Well, we have various tools, and I've shown a few of them today. Connections Expert really is aimed at showing you that insight into your IBM Connections environment, giving you data about the usage, about the quality of service, about the number of people that are logging in, the quality of your performance, and makes sure that you can actually have that insight without having to dive into the database tables themselves or the server logs. IDNA analytics I showed you to show you what is going on in terms of mail activity. Now, this is one of the uses where IDNA can be used for, but in combination with IBM Connection collaboration, if you're really driving different scenarios, it can really help you to get insight in what's going on there and to monitor that as well. And Application Insight, I showed you an example of how you can use that to show yourself which departments are using which Domino applications, so that you can then stimulate them to maybe use a community instead. To drive adoption, Panagenda also has consulting services that can help you come up with the right strategies to do all this and to really look at your environment and see where you can make big strides to further adopt your environment. And with that, I've come to my question slides. Dan, are you there?
I am here. Fantastic presentation. Thank you. We do, in fact, have 2 questions at this point in time and just about as many minutes till the end of the webinar. Nevertheless, we do encourage the audience to continue sending questions, if not within this webinar, then directly to Femke, and we'll make sure to send responses to you then directly. The first question that we had was from Suzanne. She asked, what else can we get from those mail statistics that is relevant for connections?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So I showed IDNA where you can actually get some information about the usage of mail in your platform. And one of the other things that can be really handy to show in that is the number of emails that people are sending. Is that going up? Is it going down? I showed you how you can see what is being sent between different departments and what is going on there. So there's different things that could be shown. Let me quickly show the report. So for instance, here you can see the total number of emails sent by organizational units. And that kind of information can really help you. But there is more information in this report regarding, for instance, also the use in inside and outside business use hours, whether or not people are using their mobile devices to send email. So there's quite a lot of information about email statistics that you could also then relate to your IBM Connections environment.
Excellent. So hopefully that answers the question, Suzanne. The second question was from Peter. At the point when you were speaking about active users, followers, and members, there may have been some confusion, but can you clarify what the difference is between active users and members?
Yes. So IBM Connections public communities allow users to access it without being a member, and the same goes for moderated communities. So I can go in and look at information without ever having to follow or be a member of that community. In most systems, they often only look at either the members or the followers. But the problem is that you then miss this whole big group of people that might accidentally hit your community, or that knows about the community but doesn't want to be a member or a follower of it. So that's why we differentiate between the three different groups. You can be a member and not a follower and not active. You can be a follower and not a member or active. And you can be an active member without having to be a follower or a member.
Right, okay. And we did get a few more follow-up questions. I'll go to probably the last one that we have time for. The rest, as I said, will be responded to directly. From Astrid, can I see which external communities there are?
You have the opportunity to create an export list of all the communities. And by doing that, you can then sort them by different columns. And each of the columns have different values. In this case, there's also a column that actually shows you if it's an internal community, an external community, and if it's internal, if it's a prohibited or a restricted community, a public community, or a private community. And then you can easily sort these kind of lists and see what the topics are that they're talking about, what the tags are, and what's going on there.
Okay, I thought if you have more questions to that, again, contact Femke directly. So the rest of you, same deal. We're out of time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Don't forget to keep an eye on our webinar page. That will also have the recording of today's webinar on it, and also a list of upcoming webinars in the next, or for the rest of the year at least, until we organize some more for 2018. Okay, Femke, I'll give you the last word and then I'll end the presentation.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you for hosting this webinar. I hope it was informative, and if there is any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.